Hi, it's Ben. I'd like to recap where this project is, where I was trying to take it, and to discuss with you and to hear your comments on whether that is still a viable strategy or even goal, and what you guys actually want from this project at this point. Because I'm going to have to take a step back for a few months. So I can coordinate, and I'm still involved, and I'm not going to let it die. But I think it needs... Now there are more people interested and involved, which wasn't the case at the start. Now it's time for us to think about how we can organise ourselves, and to do that it means that we need to have a common idea of where it is we want to go. So I'd like to explain my reasoning, or the rationale behind what I've done. This is going to be a very brief overview because there's a lot in there. But if you have any specific questions or you want more information about any topic, just comment in the comments and I'll do my best to follow up. So, just to recap, obviously this project is all about lazy eye, so amblyopia, the suppression of one eye, and strabism, when one eye falls to the side. And as I hope we all realise by now, this is something which happens during early childhood. And it may have physical origins in many cases, but it's actually a neurological condition. It's actually, if you like, a fuse, a safety mechanism, where the brain switches one eye off because it's better to see clearly with one eye than a confused mess with two. And this affects a lot of people around the world. The vast majority of these people will have patching to prevent, if you like, a degradation in the visual acuity of the weak eye. So what that really means is, because one eye's been turned off, or is generally being turned off, the brain doesn't maintain all of those connections that it needs to resolve what the eye is seeing. They actually get kind of hijacked by the other eye. So the visual acuity declines, and the visual acuity is actually just a measure of what's the smallest thing that you can resolve. So they actually have that sort of a circle with a gap in it, and the distance between the two edges of the circle gets smaller and smaller until you can no longer see the gap. And that's how you measure visual acuity, or one way. So in other words, your eye gets worse and worse. So the patches, by patching the good eye, the weak eye is forced into activity, and the brain is quite happy to use it because it's not seeing double, because the other eye is being turned off by the patch now. So it maintains some neurological activity, and it keeps the visual system engaged with that eye. What it doesn't do, of course, is it doesn't train the two eyes to work together, and it doesn't overcome that shutdown. Typically what happens after a bit of patching is that there's an attempt at surgery. So the eye that's fallen to one side has this sort of off-center resting position, and a surgeon will cut the muscles around the eye to shorten those muscles so that the eye's resting position gets pulled back more or less centrally. And by and large, this has no impact whatsoever on the ability of the person to see 3D or to improve their muscular coordination or anything like that. The only exception is if somebody has already had or developed 3D vision, lost it because of some visual issue or perhaps because of a muscular problem, and straightening that eye back up can cause that already learned 3D perception to reactivate. Okay, that's the exception there. Now, I gave quite a long talk at Christmas last year, 2008, at the Chaos Communications Congress in Leipzig, a 45-minute talk. And that was the first time that I'd really published anything that I'd done or talked about it. And I was a very lonely chap at that point. I had failed to get anybody interested in what I was doing. And it was really an astounding experience for me. Many people, many of whom are in the community right now, came up to me afterwards and shared their experiences and were very enthusiastic. Up to this point, some 90 plus people have actually, almost all as a result of that video, signed up on EyeSkills.org/volunteer. And the videos had well over 10,000 views in the meantime on YouTube and media.ccc.de. So there's been some exposure. And another thing that has really humbled me, that I did not expect, is that several people made very generous donations to help us buy hardware for the project. I really am very grateful. This has let us buy various cameras for testing and USB hubs and a laser cutter and a 3D printer. And it's really enabled us to do things that would have been difficult otherwise. So I think, actually that shouldn't be that slide, I beg your pardon. To sort of summarize the situation, why has there been so little progress over the last 100 years? Well, there's a kind of a cultural issue going on, that there are vision therapists that do something like physiotherapy. If you've had a stroke and your brain can no longer control an arm or a leg, physiotherapy can allow you to retrain the use of that arm or leg, and that's what they do with the eyes. But they do it in often a slightly kind of scientifically unfounded and a slightly esoteric, weird way. They just try stuff out until it works, basically. And that can be very effective because experience counts for a lot. But they are optometrists, and they are really at loggerheads with ophthalmologists. And ophthalmologists are eye doctors, literally almost you could say eyeball doctors. They are really into the physical eyeball. They treat an amazing array of eye disorders. They do a generally fantastic job. They're highly trained, but they aren't really into the vision rehabilitation side of things, I think, because it really doesn't fit into the structures through which they treat people. A vision therapist is a bit like a lawyer. The more time they spend with their patients, the more money they make. And they make a lot of money. Partly because the supply is so small compared to the demand. There are only around 2,000 in the world. Whereas those 250,000 ophthalmologists have an enormous number of patients each year, with a huge number of different disorders. And my experience has been that you're lucky to get 15 minutes, 30 minutes with an ophthalmologist every 2 or 3 months. There's no time. They don't have any time to help you train. And it varies around the world. I've heard quite good things about ophthalmologists in Poland, for example, who have a much stronger tradition when it comes to vision therapy. They'll give their patients things to practice at home and teach them more about the background of the disorder. But so far in Germany, it's been the exact opposite. However, there are a lot of simple tools you can use to do vision therapy or to take measurements. For example, like the Brock string, which is basically just a shoestring and a couple of beads for practicing vergence, so to bring your eyes together and to practice bringing them together. Or a simple business card can be used for a cover test. With a bit of a Polaroid filter and a couple of light sources, you can do some quite accurate eye misalignment tests. But these are all things that require some training in how to use them effectively and how to interpret the results, and they need a fair bit of background knowledge to interpret the meaning. At the same time, there is absolutely certainty a huge amount of scope for basic amateur experimentation and self-experimentation. Over the course of this project, I have discovered so many unexpected phenomena, which are not in the literature, and I suspect partly because there are many kinds of amblyopia and strabism, but more or less people are clustered into some fairly generic clumps, and the tools that are used for assessing somebody's abilities are very crude, and there are confounding effects, like when you do eye tests in the physical world and there's a background present. I've discovered that already massively triggers people's conflict cells and they go into suppression. So that's actually confounding the results. When you put people in an environment without a background, like the blackness of a VR headset, you get quite different results. And you can be much more precise in analysing what somebody's seeing. And it's one of the things that's intimidated me, filled me with hope, but also intimidated me to discover that with every user test that I do, I just discover another point in that multi-dimensional matrix of all of the possible things that you might find, you do find. It's really, really, really varied and complex. Now, that's not a bad thing, because I also intuit and see many patterns repeating themselves. I think there is definitely important knowledge to be gained and fresh understandings to be made by understanding the connections between things, about understanding precisely what triggers suppression in people once you've got a better handle on the differences in the way that they perceive what's going on around them, for example. How does that alter the threshold to suppression? Why are they suppressing in some visual settings and not in others, although they seem to be almost identical? I mean, I could talk about that for hours. And of course, there's a huge number of very talented people in the community, and because this is a biological disorder, 7% of the world's population, it really has, it's a cross-section of all the people in the world and their abilities. So you have in the community scientists and engineers and neuroscientists and computer scientists, and just there's everybody. So we could take a bit more responsibility for our own destiny if we had a means to have access to tools which didn't require perhaps such a great amount of individual knowledge. They are simpler to use and make more reliable automated diagnoses, or let's just say measurements rather than diagnoses. And if that data could play into a larger framework which facilitated specialists in research being able to join the dots and figure out where the similarities and differences and parallels actually are, that's a way in which one could unleash the power of the community and all of its many abilities and skills to actually make real progress, real in the understanding not only of the variety of the disorder, but in understanding what kinds of techniques work best in overcoming suppression and straightening the eyes and restoring 3D vision for which particular subgroups. And this, of course, leads us now to the final big lesson that I've learnt from this work, which is that there is no way around the ophthalmologists. There are 250,000 of them, and they are the dominant force in, or if you like, the bottleneck. They are the people who first people go to with their children. They're the people who identify the condition. They're actually the people with the skills, and if they knew often a little bit more than the 2 or 3 pages they read in a textbook at university about amblyopia and strabism, the skills and the general knowledge to be able to use new tools that help more precisely classify people, whereby ophthalmologists could then, before they immediately default to patching and surgery, could give people the option to train at home using a home training system, which is what I've been working towards, without it taking up more of their consultation time. Now, there's 2 problems with this. By and large, there's a lot of snake oil flying around, and ophthalmologists are also, like a lot of doctors, without meaning any offence, in general, many doctors are very much part of the philosophy that they are the ones that should be delivering the solution, rather than, like a psychiatrist would do, they are who see themselves more as people who deliver the tools with which the participant can help themselves solve their own problem. It's not the case that the doctor is providing a pill and the scalpel isn't the answer. This is a neurological condition, and the secret is in the affected person training themselves, training their own brain, which only they can do, to learn to see in 3D and to overcome that suppression with the help of supplementary environments. Now, the problem really is, if you just come at ophthalmology with credible scientific evidence, that isn't enough. That isn't something that always convinces doctors by any means. Doctors are already generally overworked, and they know what they know. They don't necessarily want to know more or learn more, and they often value their own experience more than what they're reading in a paper, because there is actually also a certain amount of distrust of the scientific apparatus at the moment, as we've witnessed with the reproducibility crises and so on. And that's an area where, and I'll go into this in a minute, the kind of approach I'm thinking of in giving people the chance to experience viscerally with their own eyes, to see what is possible for them to see, means that they are not going to be put off by somebody telling them they can't have seen what they've seen, because it's clearly not the case. And if that process involves also educating participants in the use of the relevant vocabulary and the basic scientific understanding of what's happening, it means that they're able to communicate with their eye doctor on a level. And that is the activator for the ophthalmologist taking a look at the links and the references that their effectively customer, let's be honest, is giving to them and asking them to look at. So if I recap that, these are all of the projects that compose EyeSkills. The first one, the experiment project, is all about actually a practitioner, if you like, working one-on-one with a participant together to understand what it is they're perceiving and to be able to measure it and try out different environments. So this should be a project which allows as much free-form experimentation and self-exploration as possible. And I've built a prototype for that. In fact, more than that, I've built a framework for that, which allows you to build your own environments. Right now, this is what I call the community app. Maybe it needs to be relabeled. Right now, the damn thing doesn't actually build because of a bug in Unity that many people, including myself, are still waiting for Unity to fix. Very frustrating, but that's just a matter of time before that's available again. Then comes the automation project. So I've just finished this project focused on this, which is all about taking the lessons or the insights from those experimental setups and placing them in the context of 10 minutes a day home training. And what does that mean, home training? Well, as I said, I see there being three main parts to that. There's the actual experience of what it's possible for you to see. There is the educational aspect of learning about the vocabulary and interpreting what it is that you've seen and seeing how that fits into how it's relevant to amblyopia and strabism. And there's also data collection. So as time goes by, seeing what progress is made. And this is something where from the beginning I've tried very hard to put the focus on something that's universally affordable. So this runs on a cheap smartphone in a cheap VR headset, and it doesn't require Bluetooth controllers, which by the way are an absolutely hideous nightmare. Sometimes they work with some phones, some of the time they have different command sets for, the cursors and the fire buttons, and it's really a nightmare. So the long and short of it is that you also can't rely on the person's eyes. You don't know what they're actually going to be seeing. So it's been built to have a mostly audio-driven interface, so it's sort of a storytelling approach. It starts off with a very simple metaphor of two sisters and goes from there, using only head gestures. So you don't need anything except your phone and a very cheap headset. I'll go a bit more into this as well. I'll go into more of all of these things. So then we come to the measurement. Well, it's all very well having this training at home, and it's very interesting to have the data about when does somebody think they're fusing, how many of the depth perception tests did they get right or wrong from day to day? Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? Is it not changing, etc., etc.? But we really need to be producing credible quantitative data, an objective external view of what the eyes are doing. And I can't see any way around that other than a hardware headset. And that's another project that we, with the help of a really wonderful team, we completed at a Careables event. So there's actually a website for that, eyetractive.org. I'll come back to that as well. So these three projects work together in tandem to produce this software-hardware system, which could be very useful for exploring and training and measuring the condition. Now, all of that's useless unless you've got a lot of people using it and a lot of data points, which is where replication comes in. So is it possible to manufacture this stuff yourself? Yourself being any enterprising entrepreneur who has $500 or $600? And the answer to that is pretty much yes. I think it's possible to build a replicatable manufacturing silo with dirt cheap, off-the-shelf components so that people can satisfy demand wherever they are across the world locally with local materials, where you can't necessarily send things by the post because people don't have house numbers and because they don't have a means of paying online, etc., etc. At that point in the dream, or perhaps fantasy, we have a very large amount of participants, a very large amount of data regarding the performance of their visual system. And by the way, I really need to stress here, this is anonymized data. This is very, very, very important, okay? That data needs to be made available in a way that it can be scientifically analyzed for trends and behaviors in the way that one does with big data and in science in general, so that people can pose hypotheses. In fact, that cycle starts a bit earlier. Scientists posing hypotheses, which they initially road test experimentally, they then form into alternative experiences in the home training app, and then over these many, many participants are able to A/B test that inside cohorts, having particular perceptual characteristics to see if their environment is more or less effective in breaking suppression or retraining 3D vision or depth perception than an alternative one. Now that's kind of one cycle of this spiral. We haven't finished the first spiral yet, but this is all very much at the level of prototyping. To complete another spiral, because it really needs to be raised to the next level, requires a step change in the amount of financing that's needed. And this is the big blocker. For now, I think we can complete this first cycle and we can get quite a lot further as a community. But it means that we need better organisation and we need a distribution and a delegation of responsibility. I am not ashamed to say that trying to do all these things at the same time in parallel has taken quite a heavy toll on me in recent months. Hence, I'm going to shift my focus a little bit back to actually physical bricks and mortar for a while. But it's taught me the hard way that the project has simply reached the point where it is too big for one person. It now needs a team of people who are working and putting in quite a lot of hours, preferably full time, which means again we need to find financing for that. So my appeal now is that I think each of these projects, experiment, automate, measure, replicate, verify, finance, which means finding the money, each of these needs a dedicated lead, somebody who is in charge of that project. Now I can hold on to the vision and I can coordinate, and that in itself is a massive job. But now it needs that next level. Is this something that's up your street? Is this something you would want to take on? That link doesn't actually exist yet, I've just noticed, but it should do soon, to EyeSkills.org projects. So let's go into a little more detail. I'll just effectively recap what I've said. So this is a quick look at some of the framework. Now actually I think I should probably do a whole another video just about this, because it's easy to talk for a long time about how the framework works. I really need to do an install video. There are some videos already on the EyeSkills YouTube account which you can take a look at with some examples of it in use. But basically it allows you to do things like breaking suppression and measuring eye misalignment, measuring depth perception abilities, and interestingly straightening the person's eyes, which is a fantastic trick. Also, people with alternating strabism, getting them to quickly alternate their eyes, left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right. It's something, is a trick I've discovered with a couple of people with alternating strabism now, where you can reach the point where the eyes are switching so fast that suddenly the brain is actually in the one eye is switching on before the other eye's actually had a chance to relax and fall back to the side, and the point can be reached with a bit of stress and effort where suddenly both eyes are actually active and fusing, and that's a hell of a moment. And there are also other things in there for anisikonia, but for example that's something that I built in half an hour. Same thing with the straightening, with the alternating fusion environment. The problem now is not so much building the environments. The framework's a bit messy, but it's good enough to be able to quickly build quite interesting environments and diagnostic tools or measurement tools. The problem now is that we need more people spending time working with themselves or working with somebody else. So buddying up, developer and, I hesitate to say sufferer, but participant. So yeah, that would be, if you like, these are the sub-projects. So if experiment is the main project that needs a team lead, these are what I imagine to be, for example, some of the most important sub-projects that need doing next. So setting up this buddy system so that the people in the community who are coders and developers, of which there are many, who don't necessarily have amblyopia or strabism, they're just keen to get involved, can be paired with somebody, a participant who has a particular variant, and they can work more closely, remotely, in dreaming up and cooking up experiments and sharing the results to inspire other buddy pairs. And that will generate a lot more ideas about how to extend the framework to make it more flexible, which is a project where it needs somebody who's a bit of a software architect to track what these buddy pairs are doing, and I suspect the buddies might actually be a developer, a sufferer, and a researcher, or an ophthalmologist, or an optometrist. Yeah, this maybe even triples. And then, as I say, somebody who's more into software architecture, keeping an eye on those conversations and the flow of those conversations and the results of those frameworks, those experiences that they build, thinking about how to refactor the framework to facilitate even simpler access to the kinds of functionalities that people are asking for. And I also think it probably includes migrating or exploring a migration to something like Godot, which is another open source game engine, because if anything has demoralized and demotivated me, it has been Unity, this 3D game engine that I was advised to use before I started. Admittedly, it's been a very steep learning curve because I had no prior experience, but I have literally lost months with internal bugs in Unity because we're doing some things that are kind of edge case, which at first they refuse to recognize, so you lose more time triaging them so that there's absolutely no doubt where the fault lies. And once they've acknowledged that there's a fault, they won't do anything about it. And that's just really not acceptable. If we were using a system like Godot, which is truly open source, we would actually have the ability to look inside Godot and have some chance at patching or solving the issues that we're running into, whereas we don't have that option in effectively a closed source system like Unity. The question is just, can Godot do the things that we've managed to find ways to do in Unity? For example, to enable or disable head tracking, to move virtual cameras in different degrees by different amounts, to have efficient lightening and darkening of the signal independently into each virtual camera, and many other things. So the next project was all about the automation. Now, how am I going to do this? I would play you a video of the introduction.
Welcome to EyeSkills.
Let's see what happens.
I'd like to introduce you to two eyes. You probably know them.
Okay, the outputs are actually mapped to the wrong place. Anyway, so this is, you can't hear the audio, but this is, for example, the introductory part to the very first day in the app. This is Domi. She is an extrovert, and this is Supti. She's a little bit suppressed and perhaps even depressed. So these two characters represent your two eyes, the suppressed eye and the dominant eye. And Domi really does dominate Supti, and she doesn't. It's just the way she is. This is the metaphor. And this basically depresses the hell out of Supti because she feels that she can't get a word in edgeways, so she just sits down and turns to one side and switches off. Domi doesn't mean to be doing this, but the fundamental problem in this metaphor is that they haven't learned to really communicate with each other,
Exploring how your own eyes
to understand
work.
each other. And I think that's a
We'll
reasonable
uncover more
metaphor
about what
which
they
we can
can
build
and
on
cannot
and
do,
day for day
and in time
begin to introduce
understand more about why they
more
behave the way they do.
advanced vocabulary and place that in the context of optical dominance columns, the visual cortex, the lateral genticulate nucleus, etc., etc., etc. So behind this, I've been trying to work on a framework which would make it easy to build this content, because the content itself is a lot of work. Scripting it, what are you going to put in the audio interface? How are you going to break it up? Every utterance that requires a particular image or animation or 3D interactive experience, they're all broken up into chunks and associated either with an image or an animation or an advanced sort of interactive experience. And once you've decided on how you're designing that content, which itself is a skill and an art, where I think there may be skills in the community way beyond my own, you want to have reasonable tools for getting those into Unity without having to do much coding. And so that's basically what I've been working on. Inside the IDE, the integrated development environment of Unity, it's very simple now to define nodes and different paths which those nodes might take depending on what somebody perceives. And there are pre-flight checks for all of the obvious things like, have you specified missing files? Are the images really there, etc., etc., etc. Overviews of the decision paths, etc., etc. So, and also with a view to people being able to make much nicer content creation IDE, front ends, for example, maybe web apps, which just produce JSON files, because the IDE actually produces a JSON style format that's then interpreted into producing each day's actual content. Maybe that's a bit too much blah blah, but I think it's not a bad thing to build on now. So the next projects would involve more content. Now, I've only managed to get the first 2 days of content done, which are all about learning about conflict and perceiving conflict, and already starting to categorize participants on the basis of what kind of conflict they actually perceive. But there's much more to do there. And I think that it needs somebody with the storytelling skills to really make sure that the overarching storyline, enough content for a month or two, keeps people entertained and engaged and gets the right rate of progress at the right pacing for most people, that they can really get something out of it. Another aspect to those two characters, so I lost a lot of time. I didn't lose. I put in a lot of time into those characters, and thankfully it would not have come off if it were not for the wonderful help of Rafal, who's one of the guys in the community. Shout out to you, Raf, you're a star. Who's a really talented guy in the gaming industry, particularly in producing 3D assets and skinning them, and he has a very interesting extreme form of strabism. And he has helped skin and bone these characters so that they could actually be used as the main characters in 3D training games, virtual reality training games. So I have a large list of very, I think, interesting ideas for the games that people could make, which will really give people more entertainment value while they're stressing their visual system and different aspects of their visual system and helping those different aspects play together. So that's something for maybe game developers or students who want to become game developers to take a look at. And of course, there's also a sub-project in that distribution part, if you like, the software distribution part, which is putting together a really nice App Store entry so that it can be launched meaningfully. So the next sub-project was all about the headset. So if you take a look at itractive.org, and then tractive.org, you'll see more information about the first prototype. And I And the breakthrough idea here, so I'd been through a few iterations and I wanted to make it out of wood and this, that and the other. And then I realized, well, hang on, Google Cardboard, the second generation, already has quite large lenses, 32mm lenses. What if, given that that's already flat pack and logistics are always going to be an issue, what if we replaced the central part of the Google Cardboard headset with a different module, a flat packed module that you fold and self-assemble that provides you with the world's most low-cost eye tracking? So over the course of 3 weekends and a lot of work beforehand, during and after, I took part in a fantastic project in Potsdam with some really amazing people to build this first prototype. So for example, there you see this neoprene. It's actually a flat piece of neoprene. All the files are on iTractive. You can laser cut it. It folds together with 2 simple clips, and you can turn an Google Cardboard headset into a headset that fits any shape of head comfortably and doesn't let in any light, which is really important when you're trying to do these kinds of tests and measurements and trainings. And that was an invention of Asia, who you see there, really, almost frighteningly creative and talented Iranian designer, who actually is looking for work in Germany that, is at her level, which is very high. So if you're looking for a fantastic creative designer, you could do worse than getting in touch with Asia. Now, another really important member of that team was Rene, who is still active in the community. And he, along with another pillar, Moritz, put together a stack which allows us to use very cheap endoscopic camera parts from China to monitor the eyes, to get that data onto the phone in Android, into OpenCV, which does pupil tracking, and then out of OpenCV and into Unity. So at the moment, it's just a proof of concept. The pupil tracking isn't actually there, and the vectors that should come out of it and go into the app, for example, for tracking the eye movement, so we could automatically pre-prepare the eye misalignment tests, etc., and measure saccades and measure eye straightening and all these things. That's not there either yet. Now, what is this sub-project custom PCB integration? Now, we've had some really cool ideas about how to reduce cost further and improve the simplicity and universality of the interoperability with Android, but it's going to require some custom PCB work, which we're probably going to have done in China. They've quoted us $400 for the custom PCB in 3 samples. That's actually something where, if you feel like donating, feel free to go to EyeSkills.org and donate. But that's something more for hardware guys, because we also have to think about, when we specify that custom PCB work, where do we want the infrared emitters? Because eye tracking works by, you need to have an infrared light source, because inside the headset it's dark. You don't want to be shining a bright light. You want a light source that the person doesn't perceive, hence infrared. And a lot of the infrared light goes in through the pupil, bounces around inside the eyeball and comes back out, which means that the pupil in the eye is brighter than the rest. So you get this brighter disc that's quite simple to pick up in a vision recognition system like OpenCV. But to perceive absolute movement, you need a fixed point to compare against. And that's where you actually want to be able to see in the reflection of the eyeball on the cornea where the infrared lights are. So you compare the position of the pupil to the position of that fixed point in the headset where the infrared light is being shone from, and that's how you can calculate the position of the eye. So often you will try to set up multiple infrared light sources, for example, in an L shape, or there are so many different options, and I'm sure most of that's just about working around patents. but it gives you additional information so you can be sure that the headset's on the right way and which way's left and which way's right, and relative distances as well, because you know what the spacing of the lights are. So that's going to also require another go at a custom 3D printed PCB holder, which also either holds independent infrared light sources, or we have the PCB designed in a way that those light sources are on the PCB and they're not obscured by the holder. And that's a really cool project for makers. And then there's the pupil tracking. So you get this data out of the camera, which is just a picture, and we need somebody or some people to work on that vision recognition part, getting those vectors into Unity, and then actually providing an API to make it very simple for the people developing the experiences in Unity to be able to get the information they need in a way that they need it. For example, is the eye straightening up? And they get just a float for the rate of straightening, or which eye is misaligned, and they get an enum for the left or the right eye. They can have the raw data if they want, but that's overkill for the design of many experiments. For example, if you're building experiments where you're testing whether somebody is alternating from the left eye to the right eye, and you have an object move from the right field of view into exclusively the left field of view, you just want to ask, which eye is now strabismic, to check what's actually happened. And to, for example, if you start increasing the frequency at which you alternate between the eyes, and you want to find the maximum frequency that person can currently cope with, you'll want to be doing that abfrage. You'll want to be using the API to see if at what point there is no longer any detectable alternation, or you've gone back to the eye that last alternated, and there was no time, or the eye no longer responded quickly enough to switch to the other eye, at which point you've saturated their capacity to alternate. Yeah, all of these things could be done with a very simple API. And finally, there's another project more for product designers, where I think there's definitely potential to, and this matters, guys. I mean, let's make this headset ecological. We should all be thinking about moving away from excessive consumption and plastics and wasteful manufacturing processes, but that doesn't mean things have to be ugly. How can we replace the neoprene? How can we minimize the use of 3D printed parts? Could we even replace the camera holders with very cleverly designed folded, where we fold the core with the card? Could we fold it in a way that the camera mounts actually pop up in like an origami style way, and the cameras are actually just reliably fitted and glued onto those mounts, so we don't use any plastic? Could we sew the power lines to the PCB into the actual cardboard, so they're folded with the cardboard? And I'm actually thinking, for example, about silvered thread, the kind of stuff that they use now increasingly in wearable electronics. So there's literally a small USB connector which you plug your phone into, and all of the rest is just silvered thread running to the camera. How does that work with data transmission? Does it have to be shielded, etc., etc.? Okay, yeah, many questions. It's an interesting project. Now let's move on to the hardware part. As I mentioned, there are some 7 million new cases a year, 400 million people around the world with this condition. It would be interesting if one could create a fireproof cupboard, if you like, where you have your 3D printer and your laser cutter, in fact, I think your plotter cutter and your inkjet, set up with a little Raspberry Pi that's got access to the web, whether that's over okay, let's not go into that, but let's just say connection to the internet, so that there can be some kind of central site for brokering requests, so parameterization, or a localized site, it doesn't really matter, So people put in their eye distance, their head shape, and it creates a custom design, which I've already sort of done in OpenSCAD, a first version, of the headset core and the shape of the core, and even the Google Cardboard part, and the camera holders, etc., etc. And it produces that headset there and then with the shipping address or the invoice or whatever it is in one go. It can put into an envelope and it can be shipped, or it can be taken on the next donkey to the next village. Yeah. It's one way of doing things. And I think it's kind of interesting. So the sub-projects there would be how to build a reliably fireproof manufacturing silo, which with cheap materials which are available there on site. And there might be many variants of this, because I'm thinking back to many of the places I've been in my life and stayed in my life, where you haven't really got much more to work with than twigs and mud, and a couple of solar panels and a car battery, which would actually probably do to drive the 3D printer and a plotter cutter. And I see no reason why you can't make a reasonable space if you at least give people an idea in advance how large it has to be and what they have to watch out for and where they want to run cables and things. I mean, a lot of these things could be done actually by the person on site if they're a bit imaginative and creative, but perhaps actually that sub-project's more about just a standard thing using something like a plasterboard and plyboard, or OSB and simple screws, something, a blueprint which is simple to manufacture with nothing more than a jigsaw and a screwdriver and a drill. That's actually kind of more of the way I was thinking. Obviously, these are all ideas. I mean, if there's nobody to do these things, or people think they're stupid, or people think there's a better way to do things, well, yeah, I'm all for it. Yeah. The second stage is better machine integration. So at the moment, it's a kind of a semi-manual process. I have to, bring the files to each of the machines and and really this needs to be automated. And we've made a little bit of progress on a Docker container that could do this, but there are some quite surprising and annoying hurdles. Like, it's surprisingly hard to turn SVGs into decent G code for something like a laser cutter, and to actually get that G code delivered reliably to the laser cutter over a USB connection. I'm not saying it's impossible, not at all. It's just in the time I've had to play with it, I haven't managed it yet. And then you get into the realm of plotter cutters. So one of the tasks there is a custom CNC plotter. So I've bought a Cricut plotter cutter, because the laser cutter, when you cut out the card for the EyeSkills core, it leaves horrible sooty edges, and that's not really good enough. And a plotter cutter literally just moves a knife around and cuts through the card, and you get much better results. But for example, the Cricut, in the way that so many of these consumer American things are, is locked down and doesn't want you to interface with it. And it's also got a lot of schnick-schnacks that we really don't need. I think there's the potential here to take something like an LX Maker, cheap CNC machine for 150, 200 euros, and replace the part that would normally hold like a Dremel, the CNC part, with something that holds a knife, that pivots. There's actually some very interesting designs for systems like that, for bigger CNC machines that just use razor blades, traditional razor blades, and they're held at 45 degrees, so only one corner is in contact, and they're pivoted off center so that as the direction of movement changes, it moves. But of course, you've got to modify your... Well, I have to think about that actually, but I think if the axis on which it's attached to the machine is off center relative to the corner of the blade, which might be necessary so that it can do tight turns, then you obviously will need to customize the generated G code to take that into account. So for example, it moves past the point at which the corner turn begins, so that when it then follows that corner, the blade does the right thing in the right place at the right time. So there's another interesting project, masses of student projects, or projects for interested people and makers and hackers and hacker spaces. Yeah, it's all there. Then we get to the open science part, so the valid verification of what's happening. And this project might include looking more into medical certification, because I think that's going to become ever more important. It's as soon as you start doing things like diagnosis, you become a medical product. Now, the main sub-projects here are, for example, data management. Where and how do we store this stuff and do it in a way that it's GDPR compliant, so that we are, we're all in this together. We're not interested in selling data, and we're not interested in taking advantage of each other, and I don't see why we should even have to know what the identity of a participant is. It's not... This has to be robustly designed to be extremely secure and extremely privacy aware. Now, we've done some basic design work, and there's a guy from Confluent who is doing some, at the moment, work in his spare time in creating a backend for storing this stuff. But the more the merrier. There are already a couple of people in the community who are particularly interested in privacy and GDPR compliance and so on and so forth. And I think that that's a group that should be strengthened and always involved in these design processes once they get a bit further as well. Then there's the clinical management interface. If we start getting practitioners using this stuff, they need to be able to manage their patients that they have in their offices, because if we're lucky, we'll be able to get some early adopter ophthalmologists actually trying this out and seeing how effective it is further down the line. And that's not going to happen unless we make their lives easy. Experiment deployment interface. If we have cohorts in the hundreds and thousands or hundreds of thousands, then we need to actually have a way of managing the deployment of particular builds to particular cohorts of people. So all data should be tagged with the exact build that produced it. So this is the trade-off. If we've got this experimental framework that lets researchers modify the experiences to suit their hypotheses, those changes and those modified hypotheses should all be stored in a central repository, and unless they're stored in a central repository, they shouldn't have access to the community, because that allows for proper open science. It means that raw experimental data can be made available, and it means that every piece of data can be tagged with precisely the build that generated it, so other independent researchers can take that same build and run it on a similarly shaped cohort and see if they get the same results, and people can run the same build on different cohorts. For example, people who are in a different space of perception, for example, alternating strabism against a more classical strabism, or people with panorama vision, etc., etc. Or at the same time, they might take a known cohort that's completed a particular experiment or taken part in a particular experiment and take that same cohort and apply a modified experiment. So we can't do that unless we have a good interface, a good UI for managing these experimental cohorts and the builds that are applied to their daily training environment. And I think there's also a fantastic, really interesting project in there for extending the headset to include some interesting ideas that we have for brainwave reading. But that's another whole topic in its own right. So I'm aware this is ridiculously long. It's been an hour, and I'm afraid this is unscripted. So my apologies for the pauses and ums and ahs. So I also wanted to skirt over the last project, the financing. I have tried a lot of things here. Approached a lot of charities who are probably the least interested of all the people I've approached, because they have their own modus operandi and their own Streckenpferd. People like this Kristen Blinden Mission and the $1 glasses people, etc., etc. I've approached several different kinds of investors. Generally speaking, the project is too complex and not short-term profit-driven enough to interest them, and well, that's fine. They're there for scaling, and they're there for maximizing short-term profit, and they're there actually as a form of industrialized, outsourced R&D for big companies to buy up the most effective R&D projects, and that's not what this is. So that's not a good fit. That's fine. I've approached some impact investors. There are possibilities there, but they're sort of maybe necessarily also surprisingly, they don't have a long horizon. At the moment, I'm in discussions with a national fund which does have perhaps a longer timeline. They don't expect products to be profitable within a couple of years, and I don't think this project can survive long term or really succeed unless it is in the form of a sustainable open business. There's no reason why businesses have to be, bad or manipulative or abusive or do the usual thing of becoming lazy and greedy, right? But I'm not sure any of these routes are right for this particular approach, which leaves us with philanthropists, philanthropic institutions, crowdfunding, and Patreon. So sub-projects here are really, how can we provide a basic monthly income for a couple of people at the core of this project to be able to spend 2, 3, 4 days a week working on it without impoverishing themselves? How can we find the money to pay for the medical certification process? How can we find the money to test whether we can really reach people and sell a hardware combo if we can't find somebody who's just going to, what's the word for subventionieren? If we find a philanthropist who can pay for everything, that's one thing. The only other way to make it scale is for people to pay a fair price where the organisation can support itself and it can pay for the materials and they can get a headset at the price they can afford, which has always been the goal, which is why I think, and I'm damn sure we can do it, because it's always been designed to use low-powered hardware and cheap materials. And then where do we find the money for scaling? If we can get all of these parts of this very complex puzzle to work together, how do we go from a couple of dozen early adopters to a few hundred early adopters to ophthalmologists that start to have pipelines of patients to reaching millions of people around the world, especially once and if research institutions get interested, because this is also a very interesting thing from a scientific perspective. It's potentially a Denglish, a Vorreiter, a pioneering example of how one could do open science with open source and open data and large cohorts distributed around the world using affordable hardware. I think there's also, I would have hoped that a scientific institution would show interest in this. In reality, so far, most of the scientists that I've spoken to are extremely interested. The neuroscientists, ophthalmologists, etc., they're extremely interested and excited, but that's as far as the interaction will go unless there's funding there. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem. So that was a brief, rough, shallow run-through of the state of the project. Effectively, there's a bunch of prototypes that demonstrate that a lot of this is really genuinely possible. Those prototypes can be built on to produce more robust versions that can actually be deployed and possibly build a sustainable business, whether that's in the form of a charity or a GmbH or a for-profit business, that's something to be decided and discussed. But the fundamental stumbling block is manpower and the financing to person power and the financing to pay for that person power. And this really puts the viability of this whole strategy into question. Is this strategy just too ambitious? I'm going to say something perhaps a little controversial now. I hope nobody takes offence, but I started this off for my own son. But once I realised how many people could benefit from this, I was just no longer satisfied with the idea of producing some open source that a handful of effectively, privileged, highly educated people will become aware of and will use for their own purposes. And that's the end of it. Some tiny little half-baked open source project somewhere which maybe benefits a couple of dozen people. I don't think that's right. What I think is right is that people with the knowledge and the skills and the strength and the abilities have a chance here to help people who have none of those things, but who are disadvantaged by this condition and this situation. And I think in many cases it'll be shown that they've been disadvantaged unnecessarily, because I have a feeling from my experiments to date that there's a good chance many people can overcome their suppression once they have overcome their physical problems, i.e. they have glasses in many cases. And we can do an awful lot of good here. Help a lot of people. Unfortunately, as the project's gone along, and I've traced out what would be required to do that, I have to admit it's far more complex and far more demanding than I ever anticipated at the beginning. Well, this is the stand of things. This is where the project is. And where the project goes next, whether it completes that first iteration, whether it manages to reach the next level and produce something which is actually deployable and sustainable and involves researchers, really gets into the science and digs into the engineering, all of those things are now no longer dependent on me. They are dependent on you and us. So please leave your comments here on this video perhaps, or on Rocket Chat. So chat.eyeskills.org. You can always sign up on eyeskills.org. You can volunteer. But yeah, we collectively now kind of need to make a decision. What do we really want, I think. So it's been lovely speaking to you, and I hope I've not bored you to death. Bye-bye.